Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking with Dr. Billy Lowe. Billy, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's good to be here.
Well, I'm looking forward to our conversation today. We're going to be talking all things pressure training, and it's an area I'm really passionate about, and I've always held conversations with coaches about. So I'm really excited to unpack a paper you recently did on this area. But before we unpack that paper, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm currently an assistant professor in psychology at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, Scotland, where we're developing an MSc in sports psychology. Before coming to this post, I was at the University of Essex, where I did my PhD on pressure training. And the impetus for this research on pressure training really came from my applied experience working with athletes as well as soldiers in the US Army, where I felt like we often do a really good job on the mental skills training, educating athletes about mental skills, whether it's self talk or deliberate breathing or imagery. And we educate them, they learn why those skills are important, they learn the value of training mental performance. And then they go to training where maybe it's easier than competition or the stakes aren't as high as combat. And I felt as I was especially working with the Army that we really need to give these people an opportunity to practice those mental skills. And pressure is not the only challenge that soldiers and athletes face, but it's a big one. And if we can give athletes a sense of pressure in their training, that's going to increase the need to actually apply all of those mental techniques that we're teaching them in, let's say, a workshop or a classroom setting. So that's what prompted me to do this research on pressure training.
Well, it's fascinating research. Billy, what's your sporting background and why sports psychology?
Yeah, my background, I grew up playing tennis and basketball. So I played those sports throughout my childhood and throughout high school in the United States. Uh, and like many high school athletes in the States, I just always loved playing sports. That's what I enjoyed doing the most as a kid. But I also knew that I wasn't going to go on to become a professional athlete. There were a lot of different professions within sports, sports journalism, sports medicine, which are things that I considered. But I didn't want to just write about sports for fans, and I didn't want to just help athletes. Let's say when they had a broken leg. What really got me excited about sports was performance. What do the athletes do behind the scenes to get so good? And and how can somebody like me actually help those athletes get even better? And to me, sports psychology was the answer.
Well, we're going to unpack a paper that we released earlier this year, Pressure Training from Research to Applied Practice, with some fantastic fellow authors, Mike Stoker, Joanne and Ian Maynard. And you've given us a bit of a background as to your interest in pressure training, but perhaps give us a little bit more of a description of the genesis of this paper. Where did the idea originally arise?
Yeah, so this paper is based on empirical studies that my colleagues that you mentioned and I we did as part of my PhD. And those were both quantitative studies to test in pressure training or examining previous pressure training studies, as well as qualitative studies to look at what are sports psychologists and athletes and coaches already doing and what is working for them. So how can researchers learn from applied practitioners. All of that research was based off of Mike Stoker's previous research. So Dr. Stoker is with the UK Institute of Sport, and he started looking into pressure training, how to create pressure in training environments with those two other colleagues, Ian Maynard and Joanne. So I picked up the research from there, looking even more into how do we effectively create that pressure, and also what's the best way to deliver pressure training in an applied setting, because it's not just about creating a sense of pressure in athletes. As a lot of applied practitioners and coaches know, you know, how you deliver an intervention, how you build relationships with athletes, how you communicate to them, that is really important in the success of an intervention. So we wanted to make sure that the research we were doing was not just advancing theory, but also providing concrete recommendations to practitioners and coaches. And this paper that you mentioned ties it all together and presents some of our key findings to practitioners and coaches.
I think a great place to start, Billy, would be to give us a definition of pressure training. I think most people can guess what it is, but I'm guessing you have a broad definition.
Yeah, I would say that pressure training is systematically creating pressure in a training environment in order to enhance athletes' performance under pressure in competition. So it's the idea that if we if we expose athletes to pressure, we're giving them a chance to acclimatize to pressure, figure out how to cope with it. And then once they get into competition, wow, that's not the first time that they've felt anxious or the first time that they've had negative thought. And because of that pressure training, they know how to cope with those challenges.
And is there a rich history of research into this area?
I think pressure training research is still young, so there have been uh, several researchers looking into pressure training before I started studying it. There have been a lot of lab studies looking at the effects of pressure training on performance. They might not call it pressure training; some call it anxiety training, some might call it stress training. They have looked at it, and in fact, one of the first studies that we conducted as part of this PhD was a meta-analysis of pressure training interventions across sport as well as law enforcement. Uh, and we did find that those studies showed a significant difference in performance between athletes or police officers who uh, did pressure training compared to those who just trained under normal circumstances.
It'll be interesting to talk about the basics of pressure training, and I know that's where you start this piece. You speak of the pressure training basics being the who, the what, the when, and the why. Can you talk to us a little bit about the who, the what, the when, the why?
Yeah, so who, meaning which athletes should we train under pressure? A lot of times we might think of pressure as World Cup final or the Olympic Games, or you've got a putt to win the Masters. And those are classic examples of pressure, but uh, really athletes at all different levels face pressure. A high school or academy level footballer, maybe nobody across the world cares what the outcome of their match is, but to them that might be really meaningful to make their penalty kick, or maybe the senior team coach is watching them and they want to impress that coach. So pressure training can be for anybody who needs to improve performance under pressure. So that I think a wide range of competitive athletes could benefit from pressure training, and even elite athletes who we would sometimes think, oh, well, they've been playing their sport for so long at a high level, they can also benefit from pressure training. That's where a lot of the pressure training research is taking place. And that's kind of in contrast to, let's say, athletes in a more of a developmental or a recreational setting where the focus might be more about encouraging participation and developing an interest in the sport. And in those cases, pressure training might not be appropriate.
So that's the who. And it's interesting what you've said there, because I think I can imagine a lot of coaches listening in thinking that the level where pressure training might be considered most important is what I might describe as the developmental elite area, where you might think of 16 to 18-year-olds or 16 to 21-year-olds who are, and I understand this can be quite sports specific, but who are they're engaging in their sport and they're trying to accomplish an elite level in their sport, and preempting this idea for them to get to the very highest levels, they have to perform well under pressure. But listening to what you're saying, actually, it could be younger athletes, because ultimately pressure is subjective. You can of course experience anxiety, nerves, and so on and so forth as a consequence of this perception of pressure when you're young, because a game might be, you might deem a game important to yourself. And then obviously at the very highest level, interestingly, I heard Pochettino, the Chelsea manager, speak. I watched a video which was played on Twitter, and he was talking about how he tries to inject feelings of pressure during training, and he's working with the very best players in the world. So it's quite agnostic. It feels pressure training is quite agnostic in as much as it doesn't really care so much who is in front of you. This could be important to just about everybody, perhaps not players at the participative level who are just trying to have fun, but for most participants, this could be relevant. Am I reading this correctly?
Yeah, I think you're right that principles of pressure training can apply to athletes who are maybe serious about their sport, even if they're not at the highest level. To be clear, I think we need more research at those levels to demonstrate what is the best or most effective way of conducting pressure training with younger athletes. But a lot of the principles that we talk about in this paper could apply at that stage. And I think it's important to remember that pressure training doesn't have to mean increasing pressure to the absolute highest amount in every training session. It could simply mean that instead of letting your, let's say, under 16 football team take penalty kicks one after another, which isn't realistic. It might mean, okay, we're going to make sure that every penalty kick that you take in training feels important, has some pressure. So instead of more and more reps, we're going to, you get one penalty kick in this training session. Let's see if you can convert, just like you might get one penalty kick in a match. And that's applying principles of pressure training, understanding what pressure really is, which is an increased importance to perform, and applying that in the way that a coach creates a training drill.
Well, a lot of what you've spoken to probably aligns itself with the question I'm about to ask. You've unpacked the who for us, and what about the what? What does pressure training involve?
Pressure training involves, number one, creating pressure. And we might get into that in even more detail, but essentially creating pressure means raising the importance to perform in training. So showing athletes that training matters and that can be consequences to how you perform in training, whether that is judgment, maybe they're being judged for their performance. Maybe their performance is being tracked and monitored by a coaching staff, or maybe there's some kind of forfeit, some kind of unpleasant consequence that they have to complete if they don't perform up to a standard. So it's that systematic creation of pressure, which I would distinguish from simply saying, you have to run a sprint if you make a mistake. We know coaches often do that, and that is just not at the level that we're looking for in pressure training. Because if in every training session you say, oh, if you commit a turnover in basketball, you've got to run a sprint. Well, I mean, you're running back and forth in basketball already. What's running a sprint? It's also the systematic creation of pressure is also distinct from punishing athletes. So this is pressure training. We're not just trying to teach athletes a lesson. An athlete might already know that they need to perform up to standard. A golfer already knows that they've got to be able to sink a 5-foot putt consistently. They don't need to be taught that. They don't need to be lectured on the importance of that, but they do need practice performing that skill when under pressure. And they need enough practice in order to realize where they need to improve, develop some self-awareness of what they're like under pressure, how they respond physiologically, how they respond mentally, and then more time, more opportunities to practice. And you don't get that if you're a coach and you just, administer a punishment every once in a while.
In this paper, you also differentiate between creating pressure and task difficulty, that task difficulty doesn't necessarily correlate with creating pressure.
Right, and this is where the definition of pressure training, I think, is really important. It's not just an academic idea, or not just important in these research articles. Not every coach needs to call a session pressure training. They don't have to use the term pressure training and say, oh, today we're doing pressure training. But it is important to understand the difference between something like pressure and pressure training compared to other approaches in research, things like a constraints-led approach, which might be more for improving motor skills, motor acquisition that could include things like changing the dimensions of the pitch so that you have to improve your ball control, or a smaller target, something like that. Coaches often also simulate competition. They might bring in crowd noise because they want their team to get used to performing when it's loud. All of those things, like distractions, right, those are important for athletes to learn how to cope with. And that a lot of times is good coaching, but that's not the same as pressure. If I get my team used to performing in a loud environment, that's good, but practicing in a loud environment with no stakes or little stakes is a lot different from practicing in a loud environment and when the championship is on the line. So I think this is important for coaches, because a coach wouldn't want to give their team or themselves a false sense of confidence saying, oh, well, we've done pressure training because we've made our training facility loud. when that's not really getting at the same sense of, oh my gosh, I've got to convert this penalty kick now. My teammates are depending on me. My coach is watching me. My sponsorship is on the line. Those consequences, that importance is what makes pressure different from just distraction or difficulty.
I like that. Importance is what makes the difference here, that pressure is perceived as a consequence of a shift of importance, or pressure is experienced as changes of perception of pressure. And as you were speaking there, it was making me think of the documentary. There's a documentary, one of these fly on the wall documentaries, Arsenal Football Club, Mikel Arteta asking his players to train in the lead up to their game with Liverpool. I can't remember if it was from last season or I think it might have been the season before. Asking his players to train with loudspeakers blaring "You'll Never Walk Alone," which is obviously the anthem that Liverpool fans sing. And I was thinking, I think somebody remarked again on a social media channel that this was good pressure training. I was thinking, no, this is about for me anyway, in my opinion, that's attention control, if anything, rather than pressure training. And what you said there seems to back up that notion.
Absolutely. And I think that is a good example of creating a competition environment, simulating competition. That's really creative coaching that probably does enhance performance, can help with, like you said, attention control. So pressure training is not necessarily in conflict with that coaching. You might even have pressure training during that same training session while all those things are going on, because sport is never just one challenge at a time. It's attention control and coping with pressure altogether. So it's just important that coaches understand what every aspect of training that they manipulate or develop. It's really important to know what exactly is that intended to improve. What psychological ability is that targeting? Is it coping with pressure? Is it confidence or attention control, something else? And sometimes those lines might be blurred, but in things like pressure, I think pressure is very a distinct form of stress. It's a distinct challenge that you don't necessarily get just by increasing the difficulty of a task. Because if a task is difficult, but there's no consequence to it, then you're not going to feel much pressure. It's just a little more difficult to do.
We're speaking here about the basics of training, pressure training. We've talked about the who, which athletes to train under pressure, which population. We've talked about the what, especially creating pressure and not difficulty. Perhaps a question that coaches don't always consider when it comes to pressure training is when to conduct that pressure training. The frequency of it, the timing of it. Can you speak a little bit to when to conduct pressure training?
Sure. We're still studying to find what's the optimal amount and frequency and timing of pressure training. But I think from studying sports psychologists with experience conducting pressure training, as well as listening to athletes and being informed by our own applied experience, there are a few things that we can take a pretty good guess at as being valuable guidelines. One of those is that pressure training should be done regularly. The definition of regularly might change based off the level of sport and the performance cycle of a sport, but pressure training, I'm pretty sure, is not going to work if your team happens to make the final of a competition and you you conduct your first ever pressure training session 2 days before that final competition. It's the same principles that we have for any other sports psychology intervention. It takes time. You need to give athletes time to first buy into pressure training and understand what it is, then to have a chance to make mistakes under pressure in that safe training environment, and then actually improve, apply some coping skills, learn some coping skills, and then refine those coping skills so that they're robust enough by the time you get into competition. Another consideration with when to conduct pressure training is the timing. Also, because it is fair for coaches to think about when they stop pressure training. So we know that it takes time. You need to do pressure training regularly to build up those coping skills. But there is an argument also for, let's say, doing pressure training, as you start preparing for a competition, but then as you get into, let's say, the week before an important match or 2 weeks before, depending on your performance cycle, sometimes your job as a coach is at that point not to introduce new plays, not to introduce new ideas like pressure training, but to make sure your team or athletes are going into competition with high confidence. And with pressure training, you do run the risk that because you're putting athletes under pressure and it's therefore more difficult to perform in those training sessions, that they might not perform as well as usual because you've added that pressure. So you, as a coach, would want to get to know your team, make sure you know their level of ability, coping abilities, and then make that decision. Do I want to risk them having a bad day in pressure training and then going into competition having had a bad couple days of training?
We've talked about the who, the what, the when. Leaves us with the why. You posit here that this is about, well, pressure training is about training and not discipline. You're distinguishing between the two. Can you speak a little bit to this final part of the first section?
Yeah, so it is about training, and as I've been talking about with the when, training means that we're trying to develop skills. It's all about developing skills. Of course, some of it could be unpleasant and add some level of discomfort for athletes. It's not necessarily going to be the most fun training session, but it is about training and developing athletes rather than disciplining them. And that's important. We wanted to point that out in this section for a couple of reasons. One is it's important that athletes kind of understand why this is going on. Why are we adding these consequences, or why do we have the performance director or the senior team head coach watching us all of a sudden recently? Then we also wanted to point this out because it shows that pressure training is a proactive attempt at developing these skills. It's not reactive. It is not a coach seeing their team perform poorly and then punishing them because of it. It's not just something that a coach does on a whim because they're fed up with their team. Instead, it's planned, it's intentional, and that way it's given enough time in order to create those coping abilities that it's targeting.
We're talking about planning and conducting pressure training. The next section in your paper provides the reader with recommendations for conducting pressure training. So I'd love to break this down and speak to some of the ideas in this section. You open here by talking about transparency, about purpose and process, which you spoke a little bit about a couple of minutes ago. I assume this is really, really important to be transparent with your athletes around what you're doing and why you're doing it, Billy.
Transparency is huge as something that the sports psychologists that we've talked about for this research have really highlighted. And that transparency refers to being transparent about the purpose of pressure training, as I alluded to when talking about the why behind pressure training. So we're not keeping it a secret from athletes. It's a sports psychologist might sit down with a team in a meeting and introduce the idea of pressure training, explain that we're looking to create pressure in training, and here are the reasons why. Uh, you're going to feel pressure in competition, and we want to prepare you. In fact, it's our responsibility to prepare you for pressure, just like it's a coach's job to prepare athletes for the upcoming opponent, or strength and conditioning coaches a responsibility to prepare athletes for the types of physical demands that they're going to face. And so it's being really clear up front that the athletes are going to face pressure, and that meeting might it might also include the athletes in developing the ways that they create pressure. And so that's a really key part of getting athletes buy-in. Is there's no secret, being really clear about why it's worth it for these athletes to have a less comfortable, maybe less fun training session, and explaining as best as we can the mechanisms or how pressure training is going to help them, meaning giving them a chance to develop self awareness, learn how they respond under pressure, and then improve how they cope with that pressure. Transparency can also refer to being transparent with coaches as well. So a lot of times sports psychologists, they might work maybe on the sidelines, or athletes come to them in an office, or coaches set aside time in a workshop for the sports psychologists to do their thing. But in pressure training, that's a little different, because now the sports psychologist is helping to shape what goes on the pitch or on the court during training, which is really the coach's domain. So it's important to be transparent with the coaches about, this is about dealing with pressure, not taking over your training session. This is just about complementing the training drills that you might already be conducting.
And I was going to ask, actually, because I completely understand that you're speaking about transparency mainly through the lens of the sports psychologist here, which is important to speak about. I know there are going to be many coaches listening in. Do you feel, Billy, whether through the research or through your own experiences, that transparency is as important for coaches around pressure training as it is for sports psychologists? Because I understand from a sports psychologist perspective, there's an ethical consideration to think about. Coaches might not necessarily see the world through that lens, and they might think, well, actually, by being transparent, I forewarn players about this pressure training, and it might be useful for me actually to do this in a blind way, if you like. Did you have any thoughts on that from a coach's perspective?
Sure, I think it is still important for a coach to be transparent about pressure training. That's because, one, it's going to distinguish between pressure training and that discipline that we were talking about earlier, shows that this is about the athlete's development and not some kind of punishment. And the coach, the sports psychologist, whoever is conducting or leading pressure training, they also need to make those consequences clear, those strategies for creating pressure. They have to be clear up front because you want the athletes to feel that pressure in the drill from the very start of the drill or practice game. Because if you just sneakily add a consequence in at the end for the loser of a drill, well, they didn't know it was coming, so they weren't feeling the pressure. So it's both for the ethical as well as the effectiveness of those considerations that we need to be transparent.
Now, within this section, recommendations for conducting pressure training. We've talked about the importance of transparency. You go on, you've used this term consequence quite a bit already. In this section, you unpack that a little bit for the reader. Negative consequences train positive responses. That's really interesting. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, please?
Sure. So uh, in the research by Mike Stoker, uh, he looked at all the different possibilities for creating pressure among consequences that they included things like rewards as well as negative consequences. Negative consequences are ones that are undesirable to an athlete, maybe something that's unpleasant, something that the athlete wants to avoid, something that causes the loss of something valuable, whether that's playing time or it could be something undesirable, might be judgment from an authority figure like the head coach. Those negative consequences were found to be more effective than positive consequences or rewards. Some sports psychologists and coaches, in an effort to remain ethical and positive, might think, oh, rewards would be a better way to create pressure because we don't want athletes to be avoidant. We want them to play to win, not play to avoid losing. But we're actually training those responses. We want to train that ability to think positively, that ability to play to win, so to speak, when you're facing pressure, when you're facing negative consequences. Because for many athletes, it's that fear of failure, fear of judgment, that fear of letting teammates down. That's what's going to cause the anxiety associated with feeling pressure. And if we just give athletes rewards, first, the research shows that that's just not effective. It is really hard to find a reward that is big enough, desirable enough for athletes to feel a sense of pressure if they don't get the reward. If you're just trying to entice athletes with a free meal or a cup of coffee, that's probably not going to do enough in a training session to increase levels of pressure. By introducing negative consequences, it gives us more options, whether it's judgment or some other kind of forfeit, something they lose, like playing time or selection. That that tends to create more pressure and it gets athletes more used to coping with the types of thoughts, the types of pressure, the sources of pressure that might be hurting their performance in competition. So by introducing those negative consequences into training, we're giving them a chance to learn how to respond positively when they face those same things or similar consequences in actual competition.
You're speaking to the distinguishing factors of negative consequences and positive consequences quite a lot there. Now, you have mentioned uh, two different types of negative consequences: judgment and forfeits. Judgment, in essence, tapping into that social anxiety. Forfeits, maybe tapping into a fear of failure, perhaps. Is there any research, or do you have any thoughts on the difference, the strength of difference between both of those? So is judgment more appropriate than forfeit, or vice versa? You've already spoken to earlier about perhaps the limitation of athletes engaging in sprints as a forfeit. Judgment, forfeit, what might be more powerful?
So the research on it has not shown a difference between the effectiveness of judgment and forfeits in increasing pressure. In the forms of judgment and forfeits that have been tested, but each of those categories are broad categories. So judgment could be everything from that performance director taking notes and monitoring training, or publishing or displaying performance on a leaderboard. So as athletes complete a drill, their performance is displayed for the whole team and the whole training facility to see. So those are examples of judgment. Forfeits could be anything from deselection for the next competition to doing something kind of embarrassing, like maybe singing in front of your teammates if you don't perform up to standard. So I think from an applied point of view, when you're trying to decide judgment or forfeits or both, uh, it takes knowing your athletes or team, understanding individual differences, as well as the resources available to you, the organizational structure of your team or organization, and the level of competition. So for younger athletes who are all maybe trying to move up to the next level, maybe it is having an authority figure come watch their training. Whereas for maybe a more senior athlete who's already used to having the national team coach there at training, that might not be as effective. Maybe there's a certain forfeit that would create more pressure. And of course, these aren't. You don't have to pick one or the other. So it might be a combination of forfeits and judgment.
You move on by saying that consequences may amplify pressure, but they're not a silver bullet to make up for lack of competitiveness or intensity in training. For athletes to take the possibility of consequences seriously, some amount of pressure may need to exist already in the training environment. You speak about the importance of establishing baseline pressure in your activities, in your sessions. Can you speak to us a little bit about this, please?
Baseline pressure refers to the level of pressure that athletes already feel in training. So for any team, they're going to feel some amount of pressure in training, whether that's a little bit or a lot. And that comes from things like internal competition. If they're fighting for playing time or selection, if teammates are fighting for playing time or selection, then there's already some pressure to perform well. Or it could be this desire to impress coaches, or maybe just the fact that a team has a high standard and is committed to improving and getting better. That creates a fairly high baseline level of pressure. Whereas in another team, maybe the starting five of a basketball team is so much better than the bench players that there's just not a lot of pressure on them inherently in training because they know they're going to start the next game. and they really don't need to impress the coaches in order to get playing time. So in that case, it might not be a high baseline level of pressure. And in those situations, uh, pressure training, trying to introduce pressure training, adding a consequence for not making your free throws in training, we can't expect that to all of a sudden make athletes feel a ton of pressure and for pressure training, therefore, to be effective. So pressure training is also not just a motivational tool to get a team that's not committed or is not very motivated to practice better. So in order to establish this baseline level of pressure, a sports psychologist might need to work with a coach to maybe improve the standards of the team at first, or to make training more competitive. Once we do that, those consequences, they can amplify that baseline level of pressure. It's a lot harder to make somebody who isn't sweating anything all of a sudden feel pressure to, avoid singing in front of their teammates, right, just because you announced it as a consequence. But if you do say, oh, you have to sing in front of your teammates if you don't perform up to standard, and it's already part of culture to perform at a high level and give a high level of effort in training, now that consequence of having to sing in front of your teammates, not only is it going to make you look silly, but also now it's going to represent that you did not cut it today. And in that sense, that baseline level of pressure, those high standards in training are going to interact with whatever consequence you are administering as part of pressure training.
As you're speaking there, from a practical perspective, it makes me think of, watching The Last Dance and the intensity that Michael Jordan brought to the Chicago Bulls in the 90s in practice. It makes me think of the late, great Kobe Bryant doing something similar with his team. It makes me think of, I'm going to go back to the late 1990s, early millennia, and Roy Keane doing the same for Manchester United and Eric Cantona. There's so many competitors across sports who create that baseline, and coaches, of course, create that baseline of pressure. And then what you're saying, the top up here can be the pressure training, which is the consequences. Um, to to close, you speak to the importance of the coach's role here. That really, if a coach is working with a sports psychologist, or a coach is just delivering this on their own, that the coach's knowledge is vital here, that the coach's observations need to be crystal clear around what they're looking at, what they're deriving from what they're seeing. The coach is such an important part of pressure training, aren't they?
They really play an integral role in pressure training because they are typically the ones who are running an entire training session, and their involvement therefore has a couple of important implications. One is that they know their athletes, so they might help a sports psychologist figure out what is going to create pressure for those athletes. They're also important because they are the ones who can really get athletes to buy in oftentimes. So now this is not just the sports psychologist trying out their new pressure training techniques. This is a coach saying, hey, we train for specific tactics, and we also train for specific psychological challenges that we know we're going to face. Pressure is one of them, and they can really solidify the connection between performance and coping with pressure. So we can involve coaches throughout the process, from figuring out what to do to create pressure, which drills or skills we should pressurize, and also helping athletes learn from the pressure training experience. That might mean training those coaches to observe behaviors, observe the way that athletes are responding under pressure in pressure training, and then help debrief those athletes, pointing out when they looked like they weren't coping well with the pressure and what they can do differently. And that way, the coach is active throughout all stages of pressure training. Athletes then see that this pressure training really is important because the coach has bought in to it. The coach is involved in all stages. That means it's not just some novel idea that we're testing with a sports psychologist.
Well, Billy, what a fantastic conversation. This is such an important area of research. So thank you very much for everything that you're producing in this line of work. And I know that you will have tapped the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience. How can people find you and follow you and potentially read this paper?
Sure. So anyone can email me at w.low@hw.ac.uk. That would be the best way to get in touch with me. I'm still a bit old-fashioned, baby-faced, but old-fashioned, just responding to emails rather than the gram or Twitter. Uh, so that would be the best way. Send me an email, and I'm happy to send you the paper. You can also find the paper on ResearchGate, along with the other more empirical studies that we've conducted on pressure training.
Wow, that's brilliant. Dr. Billy Lowe, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Dan. It's great talking with you.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to know what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.